In this video, I'll be looking at a Halal ETF which has outperformed the S&P 500. The line in blue is VUSA, which is a popular US-based ETF in the UK, whereas the black line is the Halal ETF. The chart you are looking at is from 2023, and as you can see, the Halal ETF has outperformed the S&P by over 10%. Before I get into the Halal ETF, I want to quickly go over the S&P 500. This is widely considered to represent the market. When people say invest in the market, they are usually referring to this index fund. It's basically 500 big companies which make up the US economy and has performed exceptionally well over the past few decades. Most investment advice would tell you to invest in this. However, as Muslims, we are not allowed to, because the S&P 500 contains alcohol and interest-based companies. But not to worry, because as I mentioned earlier, this Halal ETF has actually outperformed it. As always, I will not be saying whether I think it's halal or not to invest in. I am simply reviewing an ETF which claims to be Islamic and looking at it from an investment perspective. Always speak to someone of knowledge. The Halal ETF I am looking at in this video is the Invesco Dow Jones Developed Markets ETF. The ticker symbol is IGDA. It is an accumulating ETF, which means it does not pay out a dividend. Instead, it reinvests it. If you are looking for ETFs that do pay out a dividend, then check out my other video. This is a world ETF, which means it is not just invested in the US market like the S&P 500 is. I prefer these types of ETFs as they do not just depend on one country to perform well. It is diversified into other market areas. Also, if for example the US market declines and say the UK market overtakes it, then I'm sure they will rebalance the portfolio, so the holdings are mainly in the UK. Whereas you can't really do that with an S&P 500 or an American-based ETF, as they are limited to their geographical location. This graph shows a breakdown of the regions that the ETF is invested in. The majority of it is invested in the US, but it also has investments in other areas such as Canada, Japan, Australia, Europe and the UK. These are their top 10 holdings. The biggest holding is Microsoft, which is a common theme among Islamic ETFs, but unlike the ones in my previous video, the weighting isn't as heavy. This ETF also has other tech high flyers and companies in the Magnificent Seven like Apple, Nvidia, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta and Tesla. These 7 companies have a total weighting of 28%. And it is very tech heavy like the S&P 500. When we compare this to the S&P 500, we can see, just looking at the top 10 holdings, that 8 of the 10 companies are pretty much the same. The only difference is that the S&P 500 includes Berkshire Hathaway and JP Morgan in their top 10, which are investment and banking companies. These types of companies are not in Halal ETFs as they deal with interest. Interestingly, this is probably why the Halal ETF has actually performed better, because although the market did go up in 2023, the banking sector wasn't as favourable as other sectors, and many banking stocks actually declined. In terms of sectors the ETF is invested in, as mentioned, it is heavily tech-based and has a total of 36% weighting in this area. The majority of this will come from the Magnificent Seven. The next biggest sector is the healthcare sector with over 15%. And then you have consumer cyclical and industrials. And as you can see, all the other sectors that the ETF is invested in. In terms of the ETF's performance, we did earlier compare it to the S&P 500 in 2023. But I'm just going to have a look at it over the past year. So we're currently in February, and the ETFs increased over 23% over the past 1 year, and just year to date in 2024 it's up over 4%. And if we look at the last 6 months, we can see it's gone up over 10%. And this is also a fairly new ETF. So if we go back 5 years, it'll probably bring the beginning of it, which was at the start of 2022. So over the past 3 years and 2 months, it's gone up over 14%. Also, do remember that this ETF is based in US dollars, which means you will be impacted by foreign exchange rates. So you may or may not benefit from this depending on the currency rates. So that was just a quick video about the ETF. If you liked it, then please let me know in the comments below. And if you're still here, I would really appreciate if you could like and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you do have any suggestions for other videos, then do let me know in the comments below.